section. Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, President Trump issued an executive order titled Protecting Second Amendment Rights. This executive order reaffirmed constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens to keep and bear arms, which of course is part of the Bill of Rights, the most precious of those rights and liberties that have been protected since the beginning of our country. This executive order directs Attorney General Pam Bondi to review and develop a plan to rescind President Biden's overreach when it comes to firearm regulation. The President's executive order comes on the heels of 4 years of President Biden's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, otherwise known as ATF, from trampling on Americans' Second Amendment rights. This started in 2021 with the Biden administration's so-called zero-tolerance policy. President Biden's ATF used this policy to revoke the licenses of firearms licensees, or FFLs, over minor bookkeeping violations. For decades, the ATF had a history of working with the FFLs to address minor unintentional violations and actually help them correct them. Historically, they would only revoke a FFL license in more extreme situations where the FFL had engaged in major willful violations of the law and where these violations presented a threat to public safety. But the Biden administration violated decades of precedent by directing the ATF to engage in a zero-tolerance policy by simply pulling the plug on any licensee who made an honest mistake on their paperwork. Now, any of us who pay taxes, which would be most of us, know how tedious federal processes can be. I can't imagine anyone who would want to be investigated for tax fraud for making a simple mistake on their tax forms, if it could just simply be cured or rectified. But this is essentially what the Biden administration did with their zero-tolerance policy at the ATF. But the truth is, it was just a start. In April of 2022, the Biden administration decided to target law-abiding citizens who exercise their Second Amendment rights to build their own firearms with the so-called ghost gun rule. What the Biden administration failed to recognize and failed to distinguish between were criminals or people who were suffering from mental illness and the rest of the law-abiding gun owners in America. As the National Rifle Association pointed out, the policy of allowing private individuals to make their own guns as a hobby is a long-standing tradition that goes back to the colonial era. And again, a gun in the hands of a law-abiding citizen is no threat to public safety. But the Biden administration didn't care, paying no heed to our country's long-standing history and traditions, and instead preferring to please the gun control activists by issuing regulations to end this practice, again, even for law-abiding citizens. The ghost gun rule is currently being challenged in the courts, but the Trump administration doesn't have to wait for the Supreme Court to weigh in before rescinding this illegal and unconstitutional regulation. The Biden administration's rogue ATF continued down this path in January 2023 when they finalized the so-called pistol brace rule. This action reclassified pistols with a stabilizing brace as a, quote, short-barreled rifle, something it is not. As a consequence, pistols would be subject to much more stringent regulations and penalties simply for being used with a stabilizing brace. This happened after the ATF had already previously determined that a stabilizing brace would not render a pistol a short-barreled rifle. So there's obviously inconsistency in the way they've approached this issue. All this reckless back and forth from the federal government causes needless uncertainty and confusion for law-abiding citizen gun owners who want to follow the law but not quite sure what the law is, since they're being whipsawed back and forth. As a consequence of this reclassification, millions of law-abiding gun owners were no longer able to purchase a stabilizing brace, including people like disabled combat veterans who cannot shoot heavy pistols without a stabilizing brace. Overnight, law-abiding Americans who had lawfully purchased a stabilizing brace for their pistols became felons. This regulation is also being challenged in court, and multiple courts have found it to be what it is, arbitrary and capricious. I hope that under the leadership of President Trump and the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, that the ATF will act swiftly to end this disastrous and illegal regulation. As if this weren't enough, in April of 2024, the Biden administration's ATF finalized a rule known as the, quote, engage in business rule. This was an attempt to rewrite a statute that was passed by the Congress and signed into law by the President of the United States. But this was an attempt to go further than what Congress and the White House had agreed upon in that statute. It was an attempt to impose a nearly universal background check on law-abiding citizens and a direct affront to their constitutional rights. There are already background checks required by current law for anybody who purchases a firearm, but this was an attempt to go even further. Once again, this rule presents a golden opportunity for President Trump and the Attorney General to reverse the tide of the Biden administration's unconstitutional attacks on the rights of law-abiding citizens under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. I've long been a defender of Second Amendment rights for the 31 million people that I have the honor of representing in Texas, and for law-abiding citizens generally around the country. The Second Amendment is as much a part of our Constitution as the right of free speech or freedom of the press. That's why it's included in the first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. This is why I've introduced the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act, which would allow people with concealed carry privileges to exercise those privileges in other states that allow concealed carry. It doesn't change the law of the individual states, it just prevents a gotcha from occurring when a gun owner inadvertently crosses into another jurisdiction that doesn't have the same laws as their home jurisdiction. It would literally treat state concealed carry permits the same way we treat state-issued driver's licenses. If you have a driver's license from Montana or Texas or South Carolina and you drive to New York, you can't be arrested for failure to have an appropriate license. Our Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act would act as a driver's license in effect for gun owners. If someone has a driver's license, as I said, from Texas, for example, it'll allow that person to drive into another state as long as they follow that state's speed and road laws, the same way with this legislation. In addition to introducing this legislation, I will very soon send a letter to Deputy Director of the ATF encouraging him to work with President Trump on rescinding many of these regulations in order to reverse the Biden administration's reckless attacks on the Second Amendment. So while the last 4 years have been a lot of headache for law-abiding citizens who simply want to exercise their constitutional rights, I have no doubt that President Trump and Attorney General Pam Bondi will right this ship. I look forward to working with both of them to reform and redirect the energies of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives to safeguard rather than to attack the Second Amendment rights of American citizens. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I would note the absence of a quorum.